Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Indoor Air Quality Matters online workshop. How can we manage what we don't measure? Why building health depends on HVAC and IAQ evaluations. I'm Troy Raska, the Director of Marketing for Pure Air Control Services, and with me today is my special guest, Carl Steffen, who is a certified indoor environmental consultant and industrial hygienist for Pure Air Control Services. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you, Troy. Good afternoon, everyone.
So today we're gathered to talk about these HVAC and IAQ evaluations, which quite honestly are always a good idea to maintain building health and occupant safety, but have become an especially large concern during this COVID-19 pandemic that doesn't seem to be letting up. So we wanted to take a special session today to just really go over these sort of four pillars of building health as we see them and as we have developed over the last 36 years of focusing on indoor air quality as a company. So today's workshop program is going to consist of these key areas, and that is, why do we need this HVAC and IAQ testing? How do we plan for success when we're looking at building health? And then we're going to dive right into the building diagnostics matrix, right? And that includes IAQ baseline evaluation. We'll touch briefly on the ASHRAE 62.1 guidance again, specifically the operations and maintenance manual around the ventilation system. And then the importance of these HVAC hygiene and performance assessments. And then we'll look at product efficacy testing, for air cleaning products and new technologies that have been installed since the pandemic. And then we'll wrap it up today with mention of 24/7 IAQ monitoring and what these sort of security systems for indoor air quality look like. And then, of course, we'll wrap it up with questions. As a few matters of housekeeping, you can check the chat box, but I'll mention it again. And that is, we have a handout tray that will allow you to download a PDF version of today's presentation. And we also have some informational brochures about each one of these areas that we're going to discuss today. So, if you could, use the question tray to type your questions in. I'll be monitoring them as we go, and then we will try to field as many as we can at the end of the presentation. There'll also be an exit survey, and in case you have to drop out early, I'll be sending everyone an email with a link to the video replay. So anyhow, let's dive right in. What do you say, Carl? Anyways, we're here again to talk about HVAC and IAQ testing. And so when we look at that, why do we want to do this? And to some people, obviously, it's just common sense. To others, COVID has certainly brought this into sharp focus. But, first and foremost, what we like to say is that, we're kind of a doctor for the building. And we sort of have our own abbreviated terms within Pure Air Control Services, where we talk about this being, DX, diagnostics, right? So you wouldn't go to your family physician, your primary care physician, for your annual physical and walk into the doctor's office and they go, okay, well, Carl, listen, I tell you what, you look pretty good, but you know what? We're just going to send you down the hall and take your appendix out. Go ahead, go down, suit up, put the robe on, and we'll prep you for surgery. I mean, that would never happen. So you have to ask yourself the question, COVID or not, why are so many people just rushing in to buy 600 air purification units? Do they know if they're the right size for the building, for the room? Are they going to provide enough air changes? Are they safe? Do you even need them? Is your ventilation system working as designed, right? So when we step back for a second and take a look at why we would want to look at the indoor environment or this equipment, I mean, the overarching fact is that we want to reduce environmental risks, right? So we want to be able to see a snapshot of what's happening in your building and these systems. because what that's going to provide is accurate maintenance planning. You're not just going to rush in and say, well, I need this, I need that, and you're going to go to procurement or your board of directors and say, well, we need to allocate all of this capital money or this operational or maintenance money. You're going to actually, through this testing regimen, be able to justify what you need with accurate data that's science-based. So, and what does that mean beyond being fiscally responsible, being environmentally responsible? It's also going to provide some accountability, not only for these expenditures, but to your building occupants. So if you're a school, it's for your faculty and your admin staff, your students, who's has very concerned parents. It could be different for a hospital, the heightened accountability that you need. So again, it ensures occupant safety. It's going to improve the confidence of the people that work in this building. And it's also, like I said, going to provide a proactive plan for managing indoor air quality or any kind of new COVID protocols that you are trying to institute for your facilities. And then finally, by being able to have the scientific and data backup that you are in front of the situation, you're managing the situation through these diagnostic protocols, it can actually it can foster positive PR efforts, to be able to go to the public and say, we're taking a proactive approach to managing this. So again, it's pretty common sense, but when we look at planning for success, it's almost like the hub of a wheel, right? And what's gonna, hold this wheel together and keep it spinning and in motion is gonna be, set guidance. What goals are you trying to work towards to achieve for optimal indoor air quality or acceptable indoor air quality? And so certainly through COVID, we start with the CDC guidance, which for buildings is often built upon the Environmental Protection Agency guidance for indoor air quality in buildings, and certainly for ASHRAE's part, their guidance for these AC systems, ventilation systems, and such. So ASHRAE, the American Society of HVAC Refrigeration Engineers. So anyways, when we look at that guidance, now we want to look at how that's going to steer us towards understanding the baseline conditions of our building. We're going to look at how the HVAC system, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, affects those baseline conditions, and it truly does affect the conditions of the building. Then we can start to look at, once that is in a good state of operations, then we can start looking at what the product efficacy is for any of this new air cleaning technology, UV, bipolar ionization, all of these new technologies, and some of them aren't that new, but that are being put into these buildings en masse because of this pandemic. And then we can look at real-time remote monitoring, as I kind of equate it to a home security system, right? This is a security system to keep an eye on these environmental conditions. And so, as we always say, you want to follow the science or the data that these kind of diagnostics protocols are going to provide to you, and then execute based on the data that you're being presented. So execute your maintenance and optimization plans. So in a nutshell, this is what building diagnostics looks like, what I had just sort of outlined, right? We are going to take a look at the IAQ baseline. We're going to deep dive into the HVAC systems to see how they're performing, what their cleanliness state is. We can test any kind of products, and then we can monitor these conditions continually once we're able to put them in a state of acceptable indoor air quality. So I got to give a little shout out to Carl here, because he's the star of this slide and this webinar. But no, this is a picture of Carl doing, I think, Carl, right? This is some particulate monitoring here.
Actually looking at a couple in one there. Temperature, humidity, CO2. Yeah.
So that's a device that's going to read a few different parameters all on the same device, in the same measurement device.
It's a nice luxury we have now with the technology, Troy. Used to be a
Yep,
lot of
yep.
individual meters, and now we can do a lot in one.
That's awesome. So when we talk about an IAQ baseline evaluation, Carl, what we're looking at here, and certainly we've seen this to be more of the case during the pandemic, is we're looking at a systemic snapshot of the entire building. And we typically would call this service that we provide through our building sciences division here at Pure Air Control Services a building health check. But it's really a comprehensive field and laboratory analysis to determine the conditions of a building and how this building is performing. And of course, this is the indoor conditions of the building. And so, we're going to have a few main check boxes that we're going to go down and assess these specific areas of, well, maybe not concern, but what should be aligned properly to give good, acceptable indoor air quality. So one would be any kind of contaminant sources or risks that are posed to this environment. And these can be allergens, bacteria, mold, yes, viruses, wall and floor moisture, because we know where there's dampness, that creates a ecosystem, if you will, or the right conditions for microbial growth, which is living organism growth like bacteria and mold, viruses, temperature and humidity, both of which also affect how these kind of microbial constituents can grow and then proliferate in the indoor space. And then any kind of envelope test and balancing, how the building is pressurized, how that's affecting the ventilation, right, when we're looking at that. And typically we'll go by the zones that the HVAC system services, because it's kind of like each one of those zones is their own little environment controlled by that HVAC system. So Carl, why don't you take us through a few of these main or top level assays that we're looking at for the baseline, and maybe how they're conducted, or what is the importance of each of these sort of categories?
Sure can, Troy. Yeah, when you get into in the indoor environment and air quality, I say it a lot, is you can spend thousands and thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of dollars and do a slew of different tests. But what you can also do is which we've done, is kind of refined it to a lot of these main indicators, that some of which are extremely easy for us to test, and others a little bit more, but taking them and kind of bundling them and allowing them to tell you the tale, not only on their own individual level, but how they may interact with one another. And you have some good ones listed here. Something as simple as carbon dioxide or temperature and relative humidity can get overlooked, and they have such a substantial effect, not just on things like comfort, right? How do I feel in my space? But with CO2, the increase in that parts per million, that level, as you start to get up to 500, 600, 700, mostly, and you get up there towards 900, there's plenty of information out there and studies, such as one performed by Harvard, that say, hey, we have an effect on cognitive function. But as you can see there in the 2 points, we mentioned microbials, right? So these easy to read, consider air quality constituents, can have a substantial effect on things like microbial growth, right? Everybody's been kind of seeing now the big review of humidity and the 30 to 60%. Something that oftentimes can get a little overlooked, but it's not just a comfort thing. It's something where, as that we drift away from that range, we can allow proliferation of microbials. So it's very important for a number of reasons to monitor and stay vigilant and understand temperature, relative humidity, and even CO2, right? It's something where it doesn't only mean, like I mentioned earlier, cognitive function, but it's a great way to kind of assess how well is my air circulation working. If we build up CO2 in a space and it lingers there for a prolonged period, chances are we're not circulating, we're not getting enough air coming in and out to reduce that amount. And how does that relate to coronavirus, right? If we can't get enough supply air and return air in a pairing to get that space, circulated, get some fresh air in there, then the chances of us allowing not just coronavirus, but all kinds of dust constituents, hey, mold and bacteria too, right? Allowing them to just linger in the air column or stay in that space without having any chance to get filtered out back at the system. So again, just two really important, easy to read IAQ constituents. And then we get a little bit more into where the specialized and understanding and being able to test and analyze, some of these constituents comes in particulate matter is very, very valuable, right? A lot of folks are going to be familiar with PM 2.5, PM10, these particle size classes, and an overall reading of that can yield a lot about your building. It can tell you how well maybe your filtration is. Do you have a negative pressure in the building? Do we have all this unwanted, unfiltered outside air coming in? It's surprising what going around and taking measurements of just particulate matter can lend itself to suggesting. And one thing that gets, a little bit more into the technical side, gets overlooked, is actually breaking down that particulate matter. We have a number of constituents that make it up, things from as simple as mold spores to fiberglass fibers and skin cell flakes that are shed by people in the building, pollen and insect parts that can come in. And when we break down that particulate matter, it can tell a tale in a way of not only what, do we have something potentially from the outside, or do we have something being generated in the inside, right? Things like mold, fiberglass from degrading insulation liner. Maybe we just have a lot of skin cell flakes or general fibers from a dirty space to a carpet that's more than worn. So taking particle matter and then breaking it down really allows us to take a deeper dive that can get overlooked and build a better picture of the baseline. And one bullet point I really like that you have in here is the importance of surface sampling. Traditionally, a lot of the attendees here, you may be familiar with having somebody to come in and do an air sample if there's a mold complaint. And it's kind of a run in, here's a quick price, here's a sample. It's kind of hit or miss, right? If you don't get anything, is the air okay? The importance of surface sampling can really help allow us to confirm that, but also at the same time, take a step back and double check. If we get, for instance, let's talk about Stachybotrys, the black mold. It's a very heavy mold by nature. So what does that mean? It means it falls out of the air column more readily than some of the other molds like Aspergillus penicillium, which are like micro tennis balls bouncing around. So they stay airborne for a long time. Well, I've been on projects where you perform air testing as part of the baseline to better understand or ascertain the conditions. Air samples come back okay, but we do surface sampling as well. What do we find on just a desk or a little bit of a dusty surface? Well, what do you know? There's some Stachybotrys. And that really, really helps, because if we had just done the air testing, we might have said, it doesn't really show anything. Could be a clean bill of health. And this is what unfortunately happens with a lot of clients I work with. They get that initial test. It's a quick air test and everything's okay. But then they get a complaint, they have to do another one and another one and another one. So that adds up over time, and you have the frustration, HR, you have a lot of question marks. Well, the surface sampling, a lot of times, like I was mentioning with Stachybotrys, we might get a hit. That allows us to say, all right, pump the brakes. Let's stay in this space. Let's do a little bit of a deeper dive and find out if indeed we have something. And by doing that, we can track down, if we do, in the source and actually get that corrected and eliminate that from being a future reoccurring issue in that space. That's just an example, but surface sampling alone too. We can see what's settled out in the environment over days, weeks, really understand, do we have a general dust buildup or something indicative of a problem? Say a ton of fiberglass, then we might have, that's not something that should be constantly building up and coming from the outside. So little things like that. And the other bullet point you have here I love is the importance of the visual inspection. It seems pretty straightforward, right? But when you, like many other professions, when you have a mechanic, for instance, right? They can look at a car sometimes in an engine and just kind of say, this looks off, that looks off. I would have had no idea. Same idea with the indoor environment. It's something where trained eyes over years and years of practice and experience, myself, I can walk into a room and immediately start to see things and identify things that I want to follow up on, investigate more, that I note as they may be indicative of the future results I get. good and bad. So, these things range from as simple as cleanliness of a space to VOCs. Some folks may say, oh yeah, I can pick up on that, which is good. But then there's these other nuances that suggest water intrusion, air intrusion, or pressurization issues, which can have a huge inherent effect on the building. So little details and nuances like that are something that the trained eye picks up on, and it really, really helps. So many times are we able to either ID a problem before it's going to become something significant, or not just take that air and surface test, but tell you, hey, I think this is exactly what's happening and why, based on that actual visual review. So between the air, the surface, the visual, a lot of answers can be had. And as you can see, it doesn't have to be overly complex, but we have a pretty good system of how we can use multiple sample types to paint a big picture and a holistic view, rather than narrow down on just one, or narrow down on one that doesn't maybe have as much of an influence.
Yeah, and I think a good point about the visual inspection is a lot of times when you come into a new space, you can use that visual inspection to sort of guide what kind of assays or tests or experiments that you would conduct within that space to start to dig deeper and to find maybe the source of an issue that is arising, or like you just said, Carl, get out in front of an issue before it becomes a major problem within that space. So yeah, I think, the visual inspection, trusting your instinct based on experience, is going to be a huge guiding factor in this, as much as some of the written guidance that steers you in the right direction as well. And just as a side note, go ahead and explain what's going on in this picture here for folks that might not be in facilities management or engineering or something.
Yeah, some air testing is being performed there. That's right there is the classic Petri dish that some folks may be familiar with, which is used in air samples drawn through those devices, which are called Anderson samplers. Petri dish goes in the middle. Air comes through that inlet. You can see at the top there on the left-hand side that left silver or metallic device, and it impacts on the Petri dish, and it's drawn in at a certain rate for a certain amount of time, and then we can calculate through the lab analysis a general concentration estimate of what's actually in the air. And those are used for bacteria and mold, and they're used for living bacteria and mold. So you keep going on and get deeper and deeper.
You would send that back to the laboratory, and then they would culture it. Correct. To be able to identify and quantify what's going on in that space.
It's a valuable tool to understand what actually is alive and able to reproduce in a space, not just what spores are in there. We actually collect both quite often, which is what we call the culturable, which you see there, and the non-culturable, which some folks may be familiar with, is the aerosol cassette, is another test type, but it doesn't let you know necessarily if that mold is alive. And a lot of answers can come from that.
I gotcha. And you know what, Carl, we have a couple pertinent questions relative to baseline evaluations. So I think I'd like to field those right now while we're in this section, rather than holding them until the end, because they're both very good questions. And so from Randy Drag, maybe I'm pronouncing that right, I hope. Randy is asking, do you use a collection system or touch plates for the surface sampling?
It depends. We utilize both. So for your non-porous, your harder surfaces, we'll typically use a touch, which would be like a tape lift. We'll also use swab media, as almost like a cotton tip, to collect from a hard non-porous surface. If we're getting into porous carpet, things like that, you can utilize the sample type, though there's some limitations with that. Typically what I'll do is almost look at taking a vacuum sample, which is a little bit different, but kind of like what it sounds like. It's a pre-designated size and grid and sample collection type, and that's more of a, like you asked, a collection style. You can still do that from surfaces. You can still actually take a surface sample. You can actually collect the dust to have that analyzed too. So it depends kind of on the nature. I would say, a standard tape lifts are very convenient because they're very quick to analyze. They break down a lot of the dust constituents, and they're very easy to collect. So that's kind of a go-to, but depending on the history, which is another great point of the baseline evaluation too, Randy, is we always have a conversation, learn the history, understand the building, because that helps guide some of the test types without a doubt, especially surface. Just went over 3 or 4 different types. Which one makes more sense? So we're not utilizing a type that's not as helpful or over the top.
Well, no, and that's also a good point, Carl, is that a school is going to be different from a healthcare facility is going to be different from a restaurant is going to be different from a manufacturing plant. So when we would go in to look at these baselines, a lot of the scope of work is going to be based on the type of building, the use of the building, age, and these factors, like you said, the history. So I think that's an excellent point. Not to get too far down into the weeds, Randy, also for our surface coronavirus sampling that we do in the environment, we use a polypropylene tipped swab and a reagent to be able to do that swab lift and then dip into this reagent, and then the reagent is what gets sent back to the laboratory for PCR testing, because we're looking for that genetic piece of code that's in the control in the PCR and match it to what we're seeing in the environment. So yeah, there's a variety of ways we do the surface sampling. We have another question for this area of expertise from Kevin Delahunt, and he's asking, Carl, are you including outdoor air samples when performing your baseline evaluation? And what would you test for or compare to?
Absolutely. One of the foundational pieces is always collecting your outdoor air, because as many might know, mold's ubiquitous, right? So are a lot of the other constituents. So we don't intend to see a sterile, perfect environment in 9 out of 10 buildings. So there's going to be influence from the outside air. So to avoid a false positive, taking that outside air in combination with a lot of the visual things like pressurization of the building, looking at the filter racks and the HVAC units, finding these areas where a lot of coulds could occur, allows us to use a layer of protection for understanding the building. So yes, absolutely outside. If we have some buildings, say we have a 100,000 square foot building with one floor with a lot of complaints and the other floor no complaints, we're going to run internal controls, right? We're going to collect from the first floor, but also from the second floor to use a side-by-side comparison within the building. And finally, in not only just outside air, but understanding the different types of genus or species of mold you see. It doesn't even sometimes matter inside outside. If you see certain indicator species or certain unusual concentrations, that can kind of help you also ID, if there's a potential issue going on.
Excellent. Good questions, gentlemen. I appreciate that. And thank you, Carl, for the straightforward answers. So when we start to move out of the occupiable space in the indoor environment, we start to take into consideration how ventilation and the ventilation system or HVAC system is affecting that space. And so we have very clear guidance from ASHRAE, ASHRAE 180, and then of course this ASHRAE standard 62.1 that talks specifically about ventilation for acceptable indoor air quality. And as we know, ventilation has been a tremendous recommendation almost from the start of the pandemic. So many of you who have been following this closely and who had shut down and then maybe reopened again, and now unfortunately are looking at minimal operations again. It's been said we need to bring in more outside air. We need to flush the building from the air that's been recirculated and mix more outside air in, as well as other things like increasing filter efficiencies with HEPA or higher rated MERV filters. And so this standard really gives clear guidance for that, as well as setting controls and equipment to be able to have the right ventilation designed for the space and equipment. We could spend a 4-hour course, with CEUs on this standard, and we do not have the luxury of time for that today. But what we do want to hit upon with this standard is how it relates to what we were just talking about, the baseline, and how it's going to relate to what we are going to talk about next, which is the HVAC hygiene and performance assessment. So again, I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on this slide. Suffice to say that this specific section 5 and then section 8 deals explicitly with equipment, operations, and maintenance. So section 8 specifically, operations and maintenance, is telling you that a manual needs to be developed and maintained on site at your facility. And this manual would tell you how to operate and maintain this ventilation system for your building. And so, you know, this isn't an open forum or a conference where I have you all in front of us in a class. So I'll spare you, raise your hand if you have one of these. But we deal with customers all the time, and we will point blank ask them, hey, can we see your operations and maintenance manual? And they don't have one. They don't know the last time all of their systems were evaluated. They don't know, in many cases, some of their nomenclature, or don't have an inventory or a schedule for all of the equipment that they have in one place, in one binder. They'll say, well, I'll have to get that for you, or I have to, walk the premises to find it. And so this standard is saying, no, you need one of these. You need to make sure that this stuff is working properly, and here's how you do it. So in table 8.1 of ASHRAE 62.1, it goes through all the equipment, the schedule you should be looking at it on, and then the schedule for cleaning it and maintaining it. And so 13 of these specific areas out of 27, so just about half of these areas deal with the HVAC equipment and or indicators or parameters of how it needs to be operating. And so this is a very cursory overview of these 13 areas, right? But you're supposed to be looking and maintaining, so assessing and then maintaining based on what you see quarterly, semi-annually, and annually. And so again, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. This isn't the forum to do it, but start to question either your HVAC techs, if you're a facility manager, maybe your own protocols and procedures, or if you're in the C-level purchasing, maybe ask some of these questions, right? As we're looking at improving this, moving through and out of the pandemic. So we're looking at things like static pressure, the dates on your filters. We've come to clean equipment on the remediation side and went to pull filters, and they're 2 years out of date. I mean, we see it daily. So filter dates, air cleaning devices, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation. So, I don't have to go through all of these points. You can read them yourself, but the verbiage here is clean, repair, or replace as needed, as assessed, to ensure proper operation. And that's just what an HVAC hygiene and performance assessment can provide. So our technicians, Carl included, and people that are on his building sciences team will come through. They can help build that mechanical inventory for you, note all of the equipment that you have in that inventory, and then do a complete workup on all of that equipment. And so this reporting, this assessment and testing is super helpful to prioritize your system's maintenance, restoration, replacement of this equipment. And it's going to, because of the cleanliness factor and looking at the environmental conditions, the cleanliness conditions is going to help make those recommendations, again, based on hard data that's being collected and scientific study on how to optimize your indoor air quality, and in many cases, improve energy efficiency because of airflow improvements, static pressure improvements, and such. So again, much like what we look at in the baseline, Carl, right? We're going to use sort of that same method to come in to each one of these pieces of equipment, almost as if it's a mini environment, right? And take a look at it. We're going to look at it visually. We're going to take samples out of it and send them back to our laboratory to evaluate and take a look at anything that might be growing in there. We're going to look at airflow and energy testing that can be done on this, duct leakage, pressurization, tightness. I know those all kind of go together. And so, Carl, you know, you've done many of these yourself and put the reports together. Why don't you take us through some of these additional considerations for why this is a good idea to do this on an annual or biannual basis?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it is, you know, the goal behind the IAQ baseline we discussed earlier is simple. You know, we want to help keep you proactive as a client, is, you know, instead of just kind of coming and trying to just say, oh, yes or no, it's like, let's look a little bit more in depth and make sure, hey, one, if we have anything that's suspicious, we identify it now, keep you ahead of it and resolve that before it becomes a bigger problem. Or two, you know, if there is an issue, let's really dive in and find it. And the same goes for the HVAC hygiene assessments, which again, they can vary. We can keep it for 30 rooftop units to more of a visual inspection, some sampling. Again, the visual inspection being we're looking at multiple components. We're actually taking time to go through these and look at how they're aging, how they're performing, and then get more in depth where there's a lot of measurements, a lot of detailed data collection. So the overall goal, again, you know, making sure that we have a plan in place for you, or we're identifying what's a problem, or helping you stay ahead of what's a problem. And you know, some of the key foundational items of this is again, yeah, it's not just coming in and looking at a cooling coil. It's looking at the drain pan, looking at the filter rack, looking at the blower, and getting into the ductwork as well. Oftentimes, you know, you can have it's impressive how ductwork can play a role. You can have a dirty unit, fairly clean ductwork. You can have a clean unit and fairly dirty ductwork. It's always good to take a look at that system as a whole to make sure you're covering your bases. So we do a lot of these inspections, and what it entails is more than just a borescope and just poking around and looking at a diffuser or looking at a supply or a return register. We're actually getting into the ductwork. We're accessing it. We're visually inspecting it with our eyes, lights, cameras, not just kind of poking around, taking a little borescope, which, you know, we can use them. They're helpful, but it's really, I think, foundational is to take an actual look, especially if you get into terminal units like VAVs and reheat coils. They play such a substantial role and they get so overlooked. So it's a matter of getting in, gathering more detail. And yes, we include surface samples oftentimes with our ductwork and our HVAC inspections or our air handler unit inspections for the purposes of, similar to what I mentioned before in the IAQ baseline, is if we have a very light level of dust, let's just make sure what's in it. Is it a general accumulation? Sure, it happens all the time. Or do we have something a little bit more inherent that we should probably make a note of? Maybe we don't have to promptly react, but now we know it's there. We know that, hey, we need to start thinking about this as time goes on. Or, you know, vice versa. We have a lot of loading, a lot of particulate, and unfortunately, there's a lot of mold growth. Let's confirm it. Let's make sure. Let's utilize that to warrant, hey, if we're going to invest in a ductwork cleaning or a unit cleaning, let's warrant that this is needed. So that's kind of how we get a little bit more in depth with the units, and actually, you know, confirm that if something is suspect, is it, you know, is there something there, and what multiple ways can we prove it? A visual, some sampling, and then breaking down things, right? Not just one little look, but multiple looks at the system, multiple components, and then putting that all into a bigger picture, report and photographs and rankings, and actually making it something tangible that can be used strategically.
Yeah, and you know, Carl, we have another question. This is from Ross Goldstein, and it's, you know, perfect timing here. But he's asking, what about like biofilm buildup on the evaporator coils, or maybe in the drain pan? You know, what could that be an indicator of, or what might be in it?
Absolutely. Oh, biofilm can. And hey, Ross, but biofilm, you know, historically and basically, I think definitely microbials, but bacteria. That biofilm is just a great area to house that. You can even start to dabble into Legionella presence in some cases. Biofilm is something to take very seriously, especially in a hospital environment. because that's, to me, that's indicative of standing water in the right conditions. It's dark, it's damp. Microbials love that. And the water stands there, or there's a constant source keeping that pan at a certain level. And the contaminants build up, and dust comes into the system and interacts with that water, so it keeps getting a food source. It can, as we see with corrosion, some of the bacteria can even eat into the iron. They utilize that as a food source. So it's something to take very seriously when you see biofilm, not only from the kind of the human health standpoint, because we know that then that could eventually aerosolize, especially with drying, wetting, or just growing and continuing to grow. But also we have to remember that that is indicative that we're going to start to see some significant corrosion over time of our drain pan. And that is what's keeping water from obviously leaking out of the unit and other areas in the unit. So kind of twofold when you see biofilm, because they got a lot of standing water for some time.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And as you alluded to before with dust, one of the key constituents of dust is human skin cells. Human skin cells are a food source for different kinds of bacteria. So oftentimes, and you facility managers and HVAC techs know this, that you'll maybe go in to do some maintenance on a fan belt or something, and you open the door of the unit after you shut it off, and it just smells like body odor or dirty sweat socks, or maybe that odor is getting into the occupiable space. That's probably a good sign that there's some bacterial growth in there because of this kind of buildup, dust getting into the biofilm, bacteria eating it. I myself, even though I'm in marketing and communications, I've been on many job sites filming and what have you, and I've been in some air handlers that smelled like rotten fruit, Carl. Almost like a rotten apple. And of course, Dr. Sahai, our laboratory director, chief scientific officer, I was explaining that to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's a telltale sign of chaetotorium mold." A certain kind of mold, as you can see in these pictures, that oftentimes grows on fiberglass in single wall units that, over time gets damp, it sags, it starts to break down, it's very porous. And so this dust can get trapped in there, mold can start to grow in there, and it can become a real issue. And a lot of times this is post-filtration. So this mold, if it's spores, is going to blow. Some of it's going to clog and foul the coils, and some of it might make it through into the ductwork and into the occupiable space. So I think these pictures are a good example. I think another thing that Ross brought up was that many systems can't handle higher rated filters due to static pressure, and that static pressure can be indicative, static pressure drops can be indicative of fouled coils, like you can see in this picture in the upper left, where the airflow is impeded because the coils are so impacted by dust, debris, this fiberglass breaking down. And then also what happens to make matters worse is that because the pressure affects the unit in such a way that these filters might start to bend or crumple, so that creates bypass and can exacerbate the problem even more. And further, I think that when you look at how this is reported, right? So you've gone through the HVAC hygiene assessment, and you get a report. Well, you're going to have a report, and I've seen some of these reports that are like 350 pages long because it's, maybe it's 50 or 60 units that we've assessed in a single report. And so you're going to see every test that we conducted on it, the results of that test, both from an environmental standpoint and a performance standpoint. And then what's going to happen is we have a formula to grade all of these units based on the conglomerate or the aggregate of the condition. And then this is put into a table with red, amber, green that is going to basically give it a grade or a score that's going to guide the recommendations for what you need to do across this mechanical inventory or schedule. And so we're seeing this play out as being tremendously helpful for facility planning, for CapEx planning, from college board of directors, from school boards, from stakeholders in these buildings, because now what we can do is we can take facilities with a large inventory of units, and we can categorize them by severity, and then create a 3 or 5 year plan for dealing with this equipment, to maintain it, or in some cases restore it, right? So you can clean it, restore it, replace it. Many facility managers and CFOs, well, they'll say, well, how old is the air handler unit? Oh, it's 20 years old. Okay, well, that just needs to get replaced. But in many cases, that's not true. Many cases, obviously not the example in the lower left where the sheet metal has completely corroded away, but in many cases, these units can be cleaned, they can be coated with high performance coatings. The coils can certainly be brought back to life with great airflow improvements. And you can get many more years of life out of a lot of this equipment. The other thing that we see with this grading system is, yes, there are going to be pieces of equipment that need to be completely replaced, but maybe the budget isn't there for it. So again, with a 3 or 5 year plan, some of these units can be maintained or restored to a condition that will be operational for a few more years until that budget can be put in place, and then they can be replaced. So it's tremendously helpful from an IAQ standpoint. It's tremendously helpful from an operations and maintenance standpoint. And then, of course, you have the backup. So for any kind of compliance, we're seeing, in the education sector, right, because of the education stabilization funding, ESF or ESSER funds coming through the CARE and American Rescue Plan funding, that these types of reports are great for compliance and for justifying the expenditure to improve indoor air quality through HVAC improvements. And those are line items in this latest round of funding. And then, should you get audited, if you're a school system or a college system, you have these reports as guidance to show that this was the justification for using that funding vehicle to improve these areas of your building. So it's a win-win-win across the board for this equipment, and being able to effectively have that operations and maintenance manual and staying on schedule. And so, speaking of staying on schedule, we're going to be bumping up against our allotted time here, and we want to be respectful of you all. So we're sort of getting ready to wrap this up. But what we did want to also talk about as one of the pillars of diagnostic protocols within a building is these product efficacy studies, because again, we've seen a lot of air cleaning technology, portable filtration units, needlepoint bipolar ionization, UV in various functions, upper air UV to, in equipment UV, like in the ducts or in the air handler unit. And so a lot of times folks are just rushing out because they want a quick fix. They want to be able to say, we're doing something, or I need something on the wall of my classroom so that for the open house, the parents can see we're doing something. And maybe that unit isn't even the right size for that classroom, or maybe the size of the bipolar ionization device isn't big enough to output the amount of ions needed to take care of that section of ductwork, or to even make it to the occupiable space. So we do 2 ways of product efficacy testing, and one way is more on the manufacturing side, or to give you assurances that any product that we're going to recommend, Pure Air Control Services, we're going to test them in our own laboratory, and we have an environmental test chamber. In fact, I think 2 months ago, Dr. Sahai, our Chief Scientific Officer and Lab Director, and myself, we did a webinar solely on this product efficacy study piece. And so that's on our YouTube channel. Many of you might have attended it, but if you have a deeper interest in this, I suggest that you check out Pure Air Control Services on YouTube, and you can find this particular workshop, and we go into great detail. But suffice to say, this is one of the few commercial test chambers outside of academic research that is made available to other HVAC companies to test their products, as you can see in this picture, outside of this test chamber. And then as you can see as the internal picture of this air purifier inside the test chamber. So we can test for all kinds of simulated conditions, environmental conditions that you would find in the field. However, many of you have installed a lot of this equipment, and maybe you don't know whether it's working or not, or you're going by the technical specification provided by the manufacturer, but you haven't done any efficacy testing yourself to know whether it works. And so we can provide that. If you know that you're going to be making a large purchase or a large deployment of this kind of technology, and the manufacturer you're buying it from doesn't provide it themselves, you can bring us in to provide that kind of compliance testing. If you've already installed some of this stuff and maybe it's coming under scrutiny through other outside studies, through the media, you could bring us in to take a look at how this is performing or how this is helping or hindering your space. So Carl, I mean, just kind of quickly, maybe go through some of this and maybe how it's a little different from a building health check, let's say.
Sure. I mean, it's certainly product specific. It's constituent specific, because a lot of these products, they make a claim and they're tested in laboratories and approved in the laboratory setting to have an effect on improving indoor air, whether it be a zero ozone emissions such as a UL 2998, or something along the lines of, X number of ions should be coming into the space. There's all these different aspects that are tested in laboratories and proven, but what happens when we get into the real world environment? And this is something, well, before coronavirus, I always discussed. I love doing it because if you do get a good product and it's installed correctly, you're going to see an improvement. And to me, especially in this atmosphere we're in right now, what's better than saying, hey, we put these in. Oh, by the way, we want to step further. We made this large investment. Wasn't much more to have somebody come in and verify it's working, because I can, speak from experience. I've seen everything from bipolar ionizers installed in a unit that had final filters, and if nobody had tested and looked, they were finding, hey, no ions are coming to space. Why? Something that simple, relocate them, boom, we're back in business. I've seen the effects of well-installed HEPA air purifiers in a room. I've seen the effects of a missized one. So, I think it's very helpful to take that extra step to document it, not only for, hey, we made this purchase and it's working, but that ability to be transparent with your occupants, with your staff, because we're in a world where a lot of people are asking questions. And to me, what's easier than having a piece of paper to hand over versus a moment of silence and question marks, and then who knows where it goes from there, and we hear a horror story. So I always recommend it. I think it's the real world is much different than the lab, which has been an inherent problem with some of the installations. And once you understand that and can document that, you are smooth sailing.
I think it's a great point. Obviously our main focus is understanding the baseline of the occupied space, the HVAC equipment. Once any deficiencies in those areas are addressed, hey, then you're good. Let's start talking about supplemental items that can maintain that acceptable level of indoor air quality. Now, I mean, there are certain types of buildings in certain regions where you might not even have a centralized HVAC system. And of course, then that's when we really want to take a look at those buildings and make the proper recommendations for any kind of air scrubbing device that you're going to put into those offices and classrooms and spaces. Again, like portable HEPA filtration, maybe upper air UV and such. So, you don't want to just go with the cheapest or what have you. Again, we're seeing this all the time, especially with air purification units, where a school system might go out to a bid and they have no clear defined specification for what they're looking for. And so the powers that be in purchasing or the school board is just going to look at the lowest price. They're going to buy a bunch of plastic junk, stick it in the corner of the room, and it's not going to do anything. And they just spent $5 million. We're seeing this
caught up on
happen
some of
every
the
day.
Yeah, as I say, the other big thing to be careful is.
And so that's why we really encourage folks, and sometimes we get on these calls and they say, well, I'm good, I'm buying XYZ. And we say, well, have you done an assessment of the space that you're looking at to see, and if these are going to be able to create the amount of air changes an hour that you need? How many CFMs or cubic feet per minute are the fans putting out in these air purification units? What kind of filtration stages do they have in them? And all of these questions, and a lot of times, like Carl just said, on the efficacy side, these folks will go, long silence, puzzled look on their face because they don't know. And so, again, sometimes we're seeing people, stepping over a $5 bill to pick up a nickel, right? Whereas if they would have taken an inexpensive consultative route, they could have the right equipment for the right size of their space at the right price, and most importantly, have it be effective. So that's some of the other things to think about, maybe the front-loaded side of product testing or evaluation or consultation. And then finally, once you have all of the conditions met for acceptable indoor air quality and for risk management, we feel good about leaving that environment and having this series of monitors installed across the campus of the building, across the office building, the school, what have you. And then what you can do is you can kind of walk out and just start monitoring it in real time, 24/7. And really, this is our IAQ Guard platform that provides 24/7 monitoring. We recommend, as based on guidance of like the Well Building Institute and USGBC. So for like their lead programs, reset, we're seeing the number of these nodes fall into the 1 every 2,000 to 3,500 square foot range. And typically these will be put near a thermostat, and they're, because the thermostat's taking some of its own readings too to be able to set the controls in that zone. And so what these monitors look for is temperature, relative humidity, CO2, particulate matters, in 3 different sizes now. We're looking at the total of volatile organic compounds, so an aggregate number of the volatile organic compounds. We can also look at formaldehyde, carbon monoxide, and some other custom monitor custom sensor arrangements. And so basically these are great. You can establish a standard for operations. So what does that mean? We're going to go through and set thresholds for all of these parameters that you see on this dashboard. And if anything should trend out of that acceptable quality, for a certain period of time. So if it just spikes up and the temperature goes up or the CO2 goes up for an hour and then it comes back down, well, no, you're not going to want to set a parameter to send you an alert for that. But if it goes up and stays that way for 24 hours or 48 hours, ding, 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 it should send you an alert. It should send one of our building sciences team an alert, and then we can instantly huddle and get out in front of what might be causing that issue. So you can monitor trends for early detection, and then of course ensure building compliance if you're in one of these reset well or lead programs. So again, really briefly, because we're up against our time slot, but really briefly, I think, Carl, the benefits of this are pretty clear, aren't they? And maybe you can expound on those and then tell you how we sort of practically use these to assist us with some of these other baseline and product efficacy studies.
I mean, look at its simplest form. These devices give us the ability to document and share air quality levels. If we, have, let's say, a clean, tight building, you've put in purification systems, things like that, you're confident, we know the building's running well. Here's a great way to share that, hey, Joe and Jan, you're walking into a safe space, and here's something to prove it right at the lobby. And again, if, on the flip side of that is the ability, though, to also detect if something, an anomaly does occur, and actually have something to give you a heads up rather than hear about it 2 days later, and to hopefully, like Troy said, stay ahead of it. Talk to us, right? With IAQ Guard, this is pure error. I work with a lot of the clients to help them when something does happen, or if they do have questions. So it's not just, hey, here's your system C. It's hey, there's environmental experts here to readily assist you, and that's something we love doing. And then there's a lot of different ways we use it. Even myself, I use it as part of, like Troy said, long-term, years and years of in place for monitoring. For short-term, if there's a complaint in an office, right? We love to come out and do our baseline assessment, but sometimes we will suggest, hey, let's also leave something in place so we can see if we can tackle this and track this and find out maybe some sort of long-term trend gives us another insight into what's going on. And I've seen that happen. Something as simple as a mold complaint ended up being VOC usage, and whiteboard Sharpie marker, not Sharpie Expo markers, you see the VOC trend go up. The VOCs have a significant effect on us as our sinuses, our reactions. So little things like that can be answered through the IAQ Guard system. We even use it with our duct cleaning projects to actually track particles inside and outside of containment. So we can make a complete work stop, goodness forbid, knock on wood, something was to happen, we had a breach or some sort of unexpected particles getting out of the work zone. So it's very versatile. It has the updates. We can, the reporting abilities and the 24/7. So I absolutely love working with it.
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, just another quick example is that one of our customers, Moffitt Cancer Center, was having some renovations done near one of their surgical suites. And so they brought us in to temporarily install this IAQ Guard system to monitor, especially for particulate matter, during this renovation. And of course, the renovation was being done under strict guidelines and the hospital's ICRA, and it was under containment, but they were still very concerned about any proliferation of construction dust particulates. So we installed this to keep an eye on it and to be able to set the alert threshold actually pretty low. So that if we saw an uptick in particulates, they could maybe halt the renovations if they were, having surgery either happening or upcoming. So again, we've used these long term to provide that ongoing, almost like first alert or ADT type of home security system, but for IAQ for these buildings. And we've deployed them, as temporary measures when it's been critical. I think another thing, Carl, to hit on, and then we're going to wrap this up, is the reporting that this provides is excellent because because it's a cloud-based platform, because it's logging all of the historical data of all of these parameters. You can set this up to send weekly reports if there was an issue and it got corrected, but you need to go back in time and look at a specific slice of time. You can set the report up to just generate, 2020 October and November.
That's right.
It'll produce the report, and you can choose a multitude of ways to export that report visually as a PDF, or if you wanted the raw data. Another thing about this, obviously, and I didn't see this question come through, but I almost anticipated, is yes, in most cases, this can be hooked up to a BAS system to report into a central command of controls to keep an eye on these parameters. And then in our IAQ Guard 2.0 that we're getting ready to release, so we're just coming through our R&D and beta development phases, this will be able to be communicating to other Zigbee-enabled devices in what's called an AI cluster or AI swarm. So if you have air purification devices that also communicate on this protocol, this system will be able to sense greater particles in real time and then tell those devices to turn on or turn up, ramp up to high mode to clear that particulate, and then ramp back down when the parameter reaches an acceptable level. And that's just one example of the kind of AI swarm technology that's going to be incorporated into the next generation of devices that we ourselves are developing. So again, thank you everybody. You guys have been very engaging and attendant. We we have just about everybody that joined originally still on with us. So thank you so much for attending. We hope you found this information useful. As always, Carl and myself are available anytime to email or call. We're happy to jump on a quick call, or if you want us to represent this or any kind of custom workshop to your facility staff, we're happy to do so. This is just a little bit about us. Many of you that are on are our customers. Many of you might be new to us, but we were founded in 1984. COVID is not our first pandemic. We've been through all of those pandemics since '84. So H1N1, SARS, the original SARS, right? And MERS. So we know a little bit about this stuff. And now, if you didn't hear, we were acquired by RPM International as part of the Trimco Construction and Products Group. So now we're going to get more heavily involved with them on different sort of envelope and roofing projects. As they like to say, they cover all 6 sides of the building and now inside of the building as well. So that's very exciting news for reach and customer support and service. Of course, we have 3 specialized divisions, of which Carl is part of our Building Sciences division, and he also manages our Northeast regional office based out of the Philadelphia area. We have our Environmental Diagnostics Laboratory. So combined, these are our DX crew, our diagnostics crew. And then, of course, we have our Building Remediation Sciences, or RX, our prescriptive crew. So these guys in Building Sciences and ED Lab, based on the data, is going to write a prescription, and our Building Remediation Sciences team is going to carry that prescription out. We're going to go in and make those repairs and maintenance and remedial efforts. And then, of course, we have a product company called Building Health Check that does needlepoint bipolar ionization, air purification devices, UV robots, autonomous UV robots, do-it-yourself testing kits, and some other equipment that can help support on that in that arena. So our focus is health, comfort, energy. We've done over 800 million square feet, 15,000 buildings evaluated and growing in healthcare, education, commercial interests, government. Of course, we're all accredited. We have extensive, deep training programs, and all of this adds up to helping you solve your problems in a cost-effective and efficient way to manage these risks. So again, thanks everybody for attending. We're going to hang out and see if there's any more questions. Here's our contact information. Should you need to get a hold of us. Again, there's a short survey as you're exiting. So please, it helps us help you. So if you could answer some of those questions, maybe refer someone that might need this information. Offers always on the table to meet via Zoom or Teams with your facility staff or your stakeholders in your building, and kind of do a town hall or roundtable and answer questions you might have. We're always available for you. Oh, I see another question that came in, Carl, really quick. I think we have a couple minutes here. This is from Kevin again. He says, I'm curious about the surface coronavirus testing. And so he's saying surface transmittal of SARS-CoV-2 has been somewhat dismissed. And he's asking, how often are we finding viable samples of the SARS-CoV-2 virus on surfaces? So I want to clarify before maybe you sort of answer this question on a couple points. And one is, even the PCR we're not detecting viable samples. We're detecting the presence or non-presence of the genetic fingerprint for the virus. So it's basically on the PCR side, we're looking at one strand of the virus that's inactive and testing to control, or testing against that control, whether it's present or not present. But we cannot determine whether it's viable or not. I'm not in the field. I'm not seeing the end user reports on these, Carl. I mean, do you know if we're finding this in great numbers, how this test is being used in the field?
Yeah, a lot of the bulk of the testing and it goes in line with the purpose or the analysis of the test, which you mentioned is a presence absence. And the advantages of that are it's easy, fairly affordable, and it's a quick turnaround time rather than a viable and trying to get into that realm. So the idea being these are used pretty much to, and then a great point about the surfaces and that, we're learning, obviously some new data showing that it's the fomites and everything, not to be as a high level. We still take it as a priority. It's still important. But we're using it to, the majority would be for cleaning efficacy. And that's super important because presence absence, we want to see an absence, which means we want to see that regardless, not only does coronavirus end up on the surface, we can touch, move it around, but even if we're getting this aerosolization, some of it's still settling. If our cleaning's working well, it's just helpful to see that we're eliminating or minimizing that area, that source, or that potential area for transmission. So yes, Kevin, it's a great point you make. But I think that you have to kind of look at how the surface sampling for coronavirus and what you're trying to achieve with it, which is we just want to show that our cleaning is beneficial, that it's working, that we're overall, adding another layer of protection for our occupants. Now you can get into the air testing realm for coronavirus. It's just going to be, to do it right, it's going to be a little bit more time, a little bit more effort, and again, there's not always a guarantee you're going to get an aerosolization that comes in to that because it's still an air sample. It's still not going to immediately grab the entire volume of the room. We're still going to have air currents. We're still going to have settlement and circulation. But certainly, it can be done. But the majority of what we're doing in the field right now is to confirm that, again, that cleaning efficacy, which is one of the many components of just helping to create the more healthy environment, is effective, and it is working, and it's leading to a decrease in risk.
I think that a good place to look if you really want to deep dive the surface testing for SARS-CoV-2 is the University of Oregon Institute for the Built Environment. They've done a lot of studies at Oregon Health, and this was during the height of the pandemic last year, where they found the surface, how do I want to put it? They found the SARS-CoV-2 footprint on the surface inside of 3 air handlers in their hospital. And they found it as far as post-coil filter banks. So it made it certainly through the return onto the pre-stage filters, into the blowers on the coil, and they even got through the coil to the post-filter rack. And then, of course, the other side of that is they've done a lot of modeling and a lot of reporting, real-world reporting in their healthcare system at Oregon on the surfaces in the actual hospital rooms with contaminated patients. Now, if you look at a healthcare environment, these patients are going to be staying in there 3-5 days, maybe longer, right? So they're in a probably smaller than 10 by 10 room 24/7 for 3 days. You're going to find SARS-CoV-2 in that room someplace. But the more interesting finding was that it actually made it through the air conveyance system. Now, where we're testing, as Carl said, we're not typically being called in to test immediately after an outbreak. People are using this, more for compliance or to show, hey, our janitorial or housekeeping is doing a good job. So we've even trained organizations and provided them the testing kits, and they send us the sample with the chain of custody, because there's certain organizations that are doing this on a every other day basis, a weekly basis. But I haven't heard any huge numbers of anything coming back positive or present. We've typically we're seeing this as just to validate cleaning practices. So let me see.
And it's a good indicator too, Troy, of remember, we don't just want to think about coronavirus. If we're cleaning surfaces, well, there's other microbials to be concerned with. Bacteria is one, right? And a lot of these cleaning disinfectants that are being used address these other microbials. So it's also an indirect way to kind of look at, hey, my surface is clean. Let's still be concerned about bacteria. Let's still be concerned about things like the flu virus and others. So again, a rough indicator, but it's somewhat helpful to utilize it in that regards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, once again, everyone, thanks for showing up today. Thanks for hanging in there with us. You've been great. These have been great questions. Again, here's our contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, just drop us an email or give us a call.